Welcome to the Polite Conversations podcast, where every episode is focused on civility, decorum, and good manners. And I'm your lovable, non-controversial host, Ina. If you know me, you know I definitely don't like to ruffle any feathers at all. Hello, dear listeners. We've got an extremely fun-filled couple of episodes coming up for you, just jam-packed with rationality. Our chat was over 2 hours long, so I've split it into 2 parts. Both parts will be available early for patrons and ultra early for premium patrons. So if you want to check out part 2 right away, please subscribe via patreon.com/nicemangoes. Not only do you get early access to episodes, but you also get to check out my brand new Patreon exclusive written series on the ex-Muslim to trad fash pipeline. Part 3 just dropped recently, and we're talking about topics like hipster eugenicists, birth rates, and spanking children. Rationally and atheistically, of course. Anywho, if you subscribe to the Patreon, you get other fun exclusives too, and you get to support this small show. Also, another way you can support it is by subscribing to the YouTube channel and by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And best of all, it really pisses off IDW fans. And now, the episode.
Are we in an epidemic of unreason? We've always been in an epidemic of unreason. The fact that we don't use the word Negro anymore, even though it was a perfectly respectful and unexceptionable term through the 1970s, Martin Luther King frequently referred to Negroes, the United Negro College Fund, and that got replaced by Black, which then got replaced by African American. But it's easier to do it with what linguists call open class vocabulary items, nouns and verbs, than with closed class or grammatical items like pronouns. And since we differ genetically, that's just the stuff of life is genetic variation, it's almost certain that we are not all biologically indistinguishable. Two overlapping bell curves. We can still be completely fair, non-racist, non-sexist, make no invidious distinctions, even as we acknowledge the plain truth that not all of us are interchangeable with one another. We acknowledge the plain truth. To a large extent, violence is a guy thing. For completely comprehensible evolutionary reasons, men compete because more is at stake in terms of their reproduction. To a large extent, violence is a guy thing. The etiquette and mores of rational discourse. Tiny divergences that I had from woke orthodoxy, questioning whether they're citing studies that suggest there is not a racial bias in police shootings in the United States, for example, which I'll survive it just fine, but a younger scholar, it may be the death penalty for them. So that is alarming. This, I believe, is a severe problem with our august institutions of science today, which seem to be falling over themselves in an attempt to brand themselves with flaming left-wing rhetoric, and symbolism and tropes, completely unaware of the fact that this is guaranteed to alienate the center and the right. Flaming left-wing rhetoric. Several hundred grad students and postdocs in linguistics petitioned the Linguistic Society of America to revoke my fellow status because of some tweets that they dug up, which I thought were perfectly innocuous, but which they tortuously argued were dog whistles against racial equality and gender equality. Dog whistles against racial equality and gender equality. Rational discourse. That even though there's always been a leftward tilt toward academia, that it has gotten more severe in recent decades. Now, there are some people who their ego is so invested in their beliefs, whether it's their own wisdom and the morality of their tribe, that they'll go to their grave believing false things, that they just can't be budged. Saying you're rational is not a giving grounds for your belief. It's a kind of irrationality to just claim it without being able to show it. And the power of rationality is it can always look on instances of itself, and it can always step back, take itself as a object of rational scrutiny, and point out flaws in how rationality is being applied at any given time. Two overlapping bell curves. And indeed, it's nothing but rationality that allows us to say, well, that guy claims he's being rational, but he's wrong. Well, how do we know he's wrong? Because we're applying rationality to his failed attempts at rationality.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Polite Conversations. Today I have the wonderful Dr. Caitlin Green here with me again. She is a friend of the show. I'm sure many of you listening know her, a linguist and a fellow IDW critic. So we always have fun when we speak to each other. Today we're here to talk about someone very specific, sort of Caitlin's specialty, and that is, Caitlin, you want to say?
It's my best buddy, Stephen Arthur Pinker.
Is that his middle name?
Yeah.
I feel like I should have known that because I've been reading about him for days, but no, I never went looking for his middle name.
He never uses it. He uses S.A. Pinker and like Stephen A.
That's
Pinker
right.
a lot, but
Yeah.
I feel like he should lean into Arthur more. It's really nice.
He does look kind of like an Arthur. But yes, hello, Caitlin. Welcome back.
Hi. I'm so excited to be here.
It's always so wonderful to have you on. So what have you got for us today? Where are we starting?
Oh my gosh. Where does one start with Stephen Pinker, right? I don't know, maybe like big picture.
Big picture is this: when you Google him, like, why do you come across a lot of photos with him holding brains and shit?
Oh, I like to imagine that it's his friends and family. That, like, each one is a different person from his life that he's just embalmed.
Yeah, that tracks.
Yeah. No, he just loves to, like, gaze inquisitively at skulls and brains in jars, plastic brains. It doesn't matter. Like, as long as he's got some kind of representation of a human head to stare at, he's a happy boy.
He's such a caricature of a rational guy.
The question really is, like, would you rather look at the picture of him staring at a skull or a brain, or would you rather contend with the bajillion different portraits of him staring inquisitively into the middle distance? You know, as the headline reads, like, I'm being persecuted by woke Marxists or whatever.
And also, I'm a completely, like, apolitical, liberal-leaning, moderate, centrist.
That's right. Ideology free since 1963.
Oh, you're a poet and you don't even know it.
Aw. Well, I did recently join a folk band, so I'm ready.
I know. I heard your video. It's so awesome. You're such a good singer.
It's my, like, mental hygiene, right? It's like how I keep myself from spiraling.
Right. No, we all need some of that. I have to paint and draw to disinfect my brain from the stuff I see online. And
I thought about you when I joined up. I was like, oh, I think this is probably what Ina gets out of the art.
yeah, for sure. It's like a form of meditation without having to subscribe to these debag meditation apps.
But you could just listen to Sam Harris, and he will do a guided one for you. Anyway. So here's the pattern that I keep running into with Steven Pinker. Like, obviously the hypocrisy is very fun, and we will talk about some of the hypocrisy that has reared its ugly head. But what always happens with somebody who doesn't like necessarily want to hate Steven Pinker or his work is they will say, I love 95% of his work. It's just when he talks about my specific area of expertise, he's completely wrong, and he doesn't understand how it works, and he can't cite or refute any of our major authors. And so he just doesn't understand my area. But when it's something that I'm not an expert in, I think he is totally right. And so, but it happens all the time, right? Like earth science people are like, oh, I think he's probably right about history and psychology and philosophy, but boy, he just doesn't understand earth sciences. And then philosophers are like, I think he's probably right about history and psychology and nuclear power, but he just really doesn't understand my area of expertise.
Right.
But if all of them got in a room and talked to each other, they would realize that he doesn't understand any of their areas of expertise, and yet he's out here trying to make us believe that he has the final answer to all of it.
So is he a linguist?
No,
he's not a linguist.
So, okay, he will often take up the mantle of linguistics because he's a cognitive scientist. So he's a cognitive psychologist. He does experiments on cognition, and language is obviously a cognitive enterprise. And so you would do linguistics research as a cognitive scientist if you wanted to, right? Mm-hmm. And he has. And so from that perspective, yeah, he's a linguist, right? Because he's published papers on things like language development, especially verb forms, like how little kids handle conjugating verbs in English. He's done experiments on that, and he's written papers and he's published them. So yeah, I mean, he's a linguist, right? But he loves to say, oh, I'm not a linguist, I'm a cognitive scientist, as though those things are mutually exclusive. And so I always make fun of him for that, because yeah, that's called a linguist, buddy.
But he's not a linguist, specifically.
Right, and you can tell through his career, he's gone in and out of linguistics. That was kind of an early phase of his career, and he wrote The Language Instinct, which people really liked, and that onboarded a lot of people to linguistics, and which pretty fairly summarized a section of where linguistics was at the time. But then he also does a bunch of other stuff. He has this whole lab about cognition and music. He is on other papers that are about cognition in some other domain. He does a lot of stuff that's not a linguistics study.
Mm-hmm. And so what do linguists generally have to say about him? How you were saying, how all these fields say that, oh, he doesn't necessarily know about maybe he knows about other fields, but he's not getting stuff in my expertise, in my field of expertise, right?
Yeah, so I've talked to some people who work on the same area as him, because I don't, right? I work on discourse and rhetoric, and my specialty is in politeness.
Is it really? That's amazing.
Anyway, but also language acquisition. It's just that I look at how adults socialize each other into language for my dissertation. So it's a little different from him looking at 2-year-olds. But I talk to people who do exactly the same subject as him, which is verbal acquisition for English-speaking toddlers. And they're like, yeah, he did some experiments, but they have some big gaps in them, and they did oversimplify the issue. And current research doesn't really agree with him anymore, which is kind of a an emerging pattern, right?
I was going to say, yeah, it seems to be a theme.
Yeah, because everybody's really interested in this idea that like when your little kid is learning verbs, they'll overgeneralize the past tense rule, right? They'll put a D on the end of a bunch of verbs that don't need it, right? They'll be like, oh, I already goed, or like when it would be an irregular verb, really,
Right.
in the adult form. The child starts out by just applying those endings. And so he was interested in like, what's the relationship of that to a child's like memory? Like what's going on? Are they like forgetting that they used to know the irregular form, or is there like something else interfering? So he did some experiments about that, but he really only looked at children's output, like what they were saying. And my friend Megan at Arizona State looked at children's expectations to see what was going on like inside of their heads, as opposed to like what they're actually saying out of their mouths. And it revealed a lot more of like a detailed picture of what children are doing. So yeah, it's like, it was fine as a stepping stone, but it was incomplete. And now there's more information.
Yeah, that's the general sense I get from him and his work as a complete non-academic.
Yeah.
I talk to too many academics on this show. I feel like
How many is too many? Come on.
I think 2 is too many.
Uh-oh.
You guys are scary.
I'm not scary. I'm so nice.
No, you're nice. Yes, you're one of the good ones.
That's right. That's because I'm not currently being ground in the gears of the academic job market. I have the freedom to be nice.
And maybe since you specialize in politeness, you can give like Polite Conversations a report card sometime.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, there's always a lot to be said. And actually, I will have more to say about Pinker and politeness later. So,
excellent.
Don't worry.
Fun little alliteration there, too.
Oh, yeah, Pinker's politeness.
Maybe we could extend that and come up with a title.
Oh, yeah, Pinker's pernicious politeness.
Oh. All right. So some of the main themes I, as a non-academic, have noticed, and this is one that really, really gets under my skin, is that when people claim that they are like, sort of non-partisan, non-ideological, they're unbiased, and they're taking an objective look at both sides, and they just happen to come to the conclusions that the left is always bad, and feminism is bad, and anti-racism has gone too far, and stuff like that. So I tend to feel, as a layperson, that they are not exactly being honest about how unbiased and objective they are. And this is something that sort of the IDW embodies so much. I think that's why I'm so like focused on that group of people, which, if we're broadly defining it, that includes Pinker too, because it's this group that won't openly ally with the right. Some of them can't help but be exposed, like Dave Rubin, because he's gotten like way out there, like being a Trumper, being anti-vax, and stolen election, every right-wing conspiracy theory he loves. Dave Rubin recently tweeted something about, speaking as an unvaccinated podcaster, Fauci should shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
As if unvaccinated podcasters specifically have any sort of authority. Right. It was a very funny tweet. But anyway, yeah, so that sort of thing, that sort of when you portray yourself as a centrist or a moderate, I tend to get the feeling that you are hiding how extremely not moderate you are if you have to say all the time that you're moderate.
Yeah, no, that's 100% right. And people have been criticizing Pinker for a long time for simply saying the words logic and rationality, right? But not actually engaging in it at all. Because it actually does work on people, right? If you just tell somebody, like, if you start your ridiculous idea with thinking about it logically, here's what it is, and then you say, like, I don't know, Marxists have infected the university and are turning the children into revolutionaries. You're like, but he said logically, so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how that works on people that aren't really thinking too deeply about this stuff, or just sort of consuming it passively.
Right. And again, like, when it's not in your own area of expertise, and when it kind of agrees with stuff you've already heard, because a lot of Steven Pinker's work is sort of like this common sense. He repeats a lot of myths that we've heard in over our whole lives. And so, like, it kind of rhymes with stuff that we kind of already thought was true, even if it's not. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we're not going to be as critical about it. And it takes somebody who's like a medievalist that hears what he says about the Middle Ages and is like, but none of that's true. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd like to quote one of the medievalists who wrote in the history journal response to Better Angels of Our Nature. She said, "Yow." That's one of my favorite quotes about what he said about the Middle Ages, because he's just saying stuff from cartoons, basically.
She just said yow.
She just goes yow. Yeah, I think it hurt her brain a lot to hear. I'm trying to find where I wrote down her name, but her chapter is amazing. But anyway, so the book is called Darker Angels of Our Nature, mm-hmm. and it is essentially a collection of the papers that went into the special edition of Historical Reflections, which is a history journal, because historians saw that Better Angels of Our Nature was like a bestseller, and they were like, oh, I wonder what people are hearing about our discipline, history. Better go check.
So just for the audience, let's just clarify that Better Angels of Our Nature is one of Pinker's books that came out. When did it come out?
Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. 2011 was released in 2011.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And it was a bestseller. And the point of that book is it's like an exploration of the ways that humanity has become less violent over time. Right. And that's a nice idea. And in some ways it's very true. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, like, a lot of his book is just like listing factoids about, like, look, there's less of this now. There's less of this now. It is obviously quite cherry picked, and it does rely on overly amplifying the depravity of the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. So because he needs to show that there was a civilizing event during the Enlightenment that is continuing to pay dividends today. That's his main thesis, right? And so in order to do that, he has to like retrofit all of this evidence to force it into that mold when it simply does not fit there.
Right. And it's so funny because I have a quote from him from when he was on Rubin's show, which should be a red flag in itself.
Yep.
Talking about how, like, the left has been shoehorning science into a politically correct position. And, he did this in the context of a conversation where they talked about race and IQ and, like, Stefan Molyneux and how he's just, like, he was brought up as a normal guy by Rubin, just like some guy who just, talks about race and IQ a lot. Like,
right.
Whatever. No other context.
We just have this interest. It's purely scientific.
Of course. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, he kind of beefs up this image of the Middle Ages as, like, everybody was getting tortured and they were all just, like, bathing in their own poop all the time and, touching their genitals in front of other people and, torturing, just, like, getting tortured for heresy and stuff like that. And yeah, people who actually study the Middle Ages are wondering where he got that from, and the answer is a picture book. It's a coffee table photo book about torture devices of the Middle Ages, among other things. But a lot of them are, he's just like not really looking at history work. So his citations are like not even secondary sources. They're like, tertiary sources. They're collections of impressions from photographers and journalists and things like that, and not from historians.
And no context or anything.
Yeah, with no real context. And so he saw a bunch of pictures of like Iron Maidens and stuff and was like, oh God, gross. The Middle Ages, right, guys?
Amazing.
And like, I have heard his critics be, even by like very fair-minded and very progressive people, I have heard his critics be described as engaging in like turf wars or being territorial when they ask that Steven Pinker please cite historians when he writes his history books. And I don't think that's fair, because they're not asking him to agree with the historians. He's asking them to acknowledge that he knows what they're saying, and if he disagrees with it, to say why.
Right. Yeah.
Like, that's not a huge ask, I thought.
Really the bare minimum, one would think.
And like, as an academic, he knows that that is the convention. And his idea of like what science is and why science is good, right? He defines science as the refining of reason to understand the world. Okay, so in order to refine reason to understand the world, in order to do the science that he says that he is doing, he needs to apply reason to the findings of whatever field it is that he is trying to describe or critique or fix, right? Like, that should be step one. You have to get a sense of the literature. You have to get a lay of the land. Like, what do the people who looked at this before me think it looks like, so that you can push back against it or reinforce it or whatever it is that your findings suggest that you should do. But you can't skip that step.
Yeah, and he seems to have a dislike for historians of science. I'm looking at a screenshot that Ted McCormick tweeted. It's a screenshot of a tweet from October 2019 that Pinker did, and it's firstly, he's angry about anti-scientism rants. Now, scientism in itself does not have good connotations.
Right, but he thinks that scientism is a slur, that only people who just hate science and progress would ever refer to scientism as a thing.
Right. Like, he just won't engage with the fact that there is like a really weird fetishization of science to the point
No, because that's what he does.
Right, exactly. So he writes, unlike past, he's linking to some, Jerry Coyne, another one of these guys, also someone who has allegedly been spitting on pro-Palestinian protesters, extremely rational, science-y behavior there. Civilized, I'd say, even.
Yeah.
But Pinker loves to cite him, and so he's linking to his blog, and he's like, unlike past anti-scientism rants in lit, cult, Paul mags, I guess literature, culture, and political mags, this is in Nature. Why? So something that was written in Nature. He's angry about it.
Yeah.
Sci-eds often outsource commentary on science and society to the clique of historians of science, who historicize everything. Imagine that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, historicizing things is really the worst thing you could do if you're Steven Pinker. And you can tell because of how his popular books are written, where he has already picked the historical event that explains everything. And so it would actually be very mean of you if you tried to point to other factors.
Right, and then he seems to think that this is because they hate science's claim to objectivity and realism.
Right. So he is the king of the straw man.
As we know, science is purely objective. Purely. Science can never have an ideological bent or anything. We've never seen any like bad science in the Nazi era or anything like that, right?
No. Well, if you ask Pinker, the Nazi era was a blip, actually. And also, it was kind of Marxist, if you think about it.
The old Dinesh D'Souza.
Oh, yeah. He's right there with them. If you actually read these books, you will see him claiming that Nazism is just Marxism with race instead of class. He explicitly says this. Which is a far right talking point since since forever, since World War II.
Yeah. And, it's amazing to me that because these guys have a little bit of a better vocabulary and don't openly ally with the Republican Party, they are thought of as so much better, so much smarter than your average Dinesh D'Souza or Tucker Carlson or whatever fucking bullshit.
That's right. And he relies very heavily on this tendency that we have to, if he's accusing somebody else of something, not imagine that he is doing the same thing. So he loves to defend himself against what he perceives as like ad hominem attacks and hyperbolic, like identity politics sort of name calling. But meanwhile, he compares environmentalists to Nazis. He compares student protests to like Maoist struggle sessions. He calls DEI Stalin-esque.
Listen, that's just rational objectivity, That's just science.
Yeah. He thinks it's really evil that, the woke people tell you what art and literature you can and cannot consume, but then devotes paragraphs to telling us why modern and postmodern art are so ugly and confusing and like shouldn't be given a place in museums, right?
I have another screenshot of a tweet from him, and this one is where he says, "Why sexist and racist philosophers might still be admirable, condemning them as individuals rather than the ideas of their era, inflates our own rectitude, obscures moral progress, and blinds us to our own shortcomings."
Oh, yeah. Nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, for one thing, condemning individuals and dismissing everything they say is like his favorite pastime. Right.
That's a pattern on the right where the hypocrisy is just so strong and it doesn't seem to matter. Right and center, let me say, because these guys identify as center, but really they're just reactionary fucks that belong on the right. I'm just so sick of it, especially these days in like extremely genocidal times, to see like centrists being centrists about genocide, really just lays the whole thing bare, right? No, that's not.
Yeah. And you can see the sort of selective attention happening in real time where Steven Pinker, who works at Harvard University, has said nothing about the doxing trucks, right? That some of the people that are on those trucks, these are these like big trucks with a big old LED screen on each side. And it says like Harvard's anti-Semites. And then it has pictures of students and professors from Harvard plus their name. And it's just driving around campus, right? And some of them are simply Palestinian students. Yeah. They didn't do anything. They didn't even protest, right? They're just there because they're Palestinian. He said nothing about that, right? That's endangering his students. That's a chilling effect on the free speech that he so dearly loves. He's had nothing to say about these students that are being deprived of their right to graduate for peacefully protesting, the students that have been like manhandled by the police, for the police of a city, rather than being dealt with internally in the university, which is how discipline is supposed to work on a university campus. None of that, right? But he has everything to say about any optics failure of the pro-Palestinian side.
Right. And hasn't he signed some letters and stuff as well?
That's right. Yeah, he has. He has signed lots of letters. He loves a letter. He loves to help write, draft an open letter, and he loves to collect signatures for letters. Everybody needs a hobby,
Do you know which kinds of letters he's signed in these days?
So he's done the Harvard faculty letter asking basically the president to do more to curb the protests. Because free expression is gross and we hate it, except when it's right wing.
Right. Had that been about the N-word, he would be all there. He would be there.
Oh, yeah.
Defending people's rights to
oh, yeah, absolutely.
use
right?
slurs.
And they love to say things like, this isn't something Steven Pinker has said, but it's something that his friend Alex Morey over at the at FIRE has said, is that these people, they love having those pro-Palestinian protests, but they would be so mad if any kind of Republican group had a rally. And it's okay, but Turning Point USA has rallies on campuses every week. Mm-hmm. And we're not trying to ban them from the campus. We don't like them, and we would like it if they didn't say genocidal things. We'd like them to be prevented from that on the campus. And we certainly don't want campus funds or the university name to be used to legitimize them. Right. But we're not over here being no, free speech is bad.
Call in the cops.
Yeah, that's just not the case. I don't want college kids arrested for going to a Turning Point event either.
Right. I mean, FIRE seems to be a joke of an organization, especially since one of the guys, Lukianoff, went on Sam Harris's show just recently to do an episode called Freedom and Censorship or something.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're all over those kinds of podcasts. They're all over Unheard, which is a right-wing British outlet. They're all over, actually all of the right-wing, the Telegraph and stuff, all of the UK right-wing media, because, I don't know, they think Americans won't realize that it's right-wing because it's not from here. Mm-hmm. And all over Quillette and all of those places,
Yeah, and they did not mention anything about the systemic silencing of pro-Palestinian perspectives, or even just journalists being silenced by their newsrooms. There's report after report after report on how many newsrooms have had these problematic bans on certain words and forced people to write about the topic in a specific pro-Israel way.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. And it has been really systematic, where, it doesn't take much to trigger some kind of disciplinary action against you. And, within linguistics, we had a sociolinguist, Yuri Horesh, get fired from his job in Israel. He said that there's a genocide happening. He did use his voice. That's all it took.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And there's just nothing to be said from these free speech warriors.
Right. So yeah, he said, I do not approve of Israel's genocide against Palestinians, and his university immediately launched an investigation. They suspended him. They found him guilty of being pro-Hamas, and they fired him.
Of course. I mean, everybody is pro-Hamas unless they're pro-Israel. We should know that by now. Biden, even though he's extremely pro-Israel, he's still been called Hamas multiple times.
Oh yeah, and, it doesn't take much at all.
Yeah, it doesn't. So
and Pinker has done that too, right? He will tweet about pro-Hamas students all day long. He
really? He's fully saying pro-Hamas students.
Yes, that's right. He's accused Harvard students of being pro-Hamas.
Now, I thought we disliked ad hominem attacks.
What? And hyperbole, right? We don't like that. Yes. And we don't like moralizing. We really hate moralizing. We certainly wouldn't want to be engaged in a morality play in which some humans are, let's say, vile race of despoilers and plunderers. Nobody's words in particular that I'm quoting there. It is absolutely... it is exactly the kind of stuff that he hates for other people to do, because it is irrational and it is unreasonable and it is not humanistic to do. And for him, humanism just means like just not believing in God. Just please don't believe in God, and then you're good. Just be an atheist. Only good things can follow from that.
Yeah, of course. As we've seen, only good things came from the new atheist movement. Yeah, we're still seeing the very good effects of it throughout society.
That's right. Okay, so that open letter, right, that Pinker signed, and which those of us who are fans of Pinker do believe that the verbiage is a bit familiar, that perhaps he did help draft it. But that's just speculation. But it essentially was just, Dear President Garber, please end the encampment through like whatever means necessary. So they said the sooner the encampment is removed, the sooner a meaningful conversation can begin.
Really? I mean...
Which is ridiculous because it takes the encampments to get anyone to engage.
Right, yeah. But they just want that silenced, I guess. Silencing and censorship and ad homs and all that is fine when you're doing it to the left, to the wokes.
Right. You just have to stop. Please stop talking. Stop being loud. Stop being in my space. And then, of course, I will have a conversation with you. Like, I know I wasn't doing that before, but,
right.
But now, oh, sure, yeah, once you go back to the conditions under which I wasn't talking to you,
yeah,
I'm sure this will go great.
I mean, it just... How do even his own fans not see through that? It really amazes me.
We are very good at just taking what we want to hear at face value, you know? It just feels good. And you get all kinds of like, well, this doesn't count. Like, that's not a good example. You know, like, this isn't really hypocrisy because of these like minute factors that also apply to the other situation. You know, people will just tie themselves in knots trying to justify these things.
Yeah. I mean, I see it all the time. It's crazy.
That's right.
I mean, the amount of intelligent people that I have encountered that seem to think that Pinker isn't so bad, even after the whole, like, Epstein stuff.
Right. Because he expressed regret after it came out.
But not really. He doesn't really take ownership of his role in that situation, right? So let's back up and talk about that for a second.
Yes. Okay. So Jeffrey Epstein did what he did, and then while he was being represented by Steven Pinker's friend Alan Dershowitz reached out to him for like a linguistic opinion, right? An expert opinion, essentially, to say like, he's under fire for enticing minors across state lines. Would you consider this to qualify? And Pinker,
but he says that he did not even ask about much about what this was for. He just looked at the text and gave his opinion. Right,
which is like the weirdest lie I've ever heard in my life, right?
Right.
Because like Jeffrey Epstein's case was already well publicized. It was already publicly known that Dershowitz, who is friends with Pinker, was representing him. The text in question was about Epstein. Like, even if you didn't know it was Epstein, the topic of it was, let's get this minor across state lines.
Right.
And he's supposed to be like, I don't know what this is about. It's just some words to me.
And here's my opinion on those words. I'm not going to ask any more questions on what it is for, but...
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like it strains the capacity to suspend your disbelief, right? That you could know all of those disparate facts and not know what you were doing when you helped with this case. Right.
So I was reading an article in Inside Higher Ed.
Yeah.
And let me just read a couple quotes from it. Epstein was previously convicted on just one count of prostitution in 2008, but what he was accused of before he brokered a most unlikely plea deal was monstrous. Trafficking dozens of underage girls in a scheme whereby they recruited each other for sexual abuse, and Pinker did rub shoulders with him before and after Epstein's first indictment in 2006. Pinker was included in the flight log for Epstein's plane, which was dubbed the Lolita Express, for example, in 2002. And then he was photographed with him at a gathering in 2014. And he shared on his Twitter an affidavit from the case via Twitter in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, it's the after that I'm most concerned with,
Yes.
right? Like, that he hitched a ride on the private plane in 2002, likely from, like, you know, Martha's Vineyard to some conference location or whatever. Like, I don't care. It is gross to me that elite academics can just, like, be buddy-buddy with billionaires and, like, use their resources, whatever. Gross, but not, like, evil. What I can, well, maybe a bit evil. But what is really concerning to me is the after. Like, after it was pretty clear what Epstein had done, that you're still rubbing shoulders with him because you're afraid of, like, you know, losing some funding or some power. Like, grow a backbone, you know, like get a little bit of moral clarity. Yeah,
like someone that's accused of all these monstrous crimes, trafficking dozens of underage girls, and then you provide your expert help. I mean, it just doesn't hold up that you just simply did not know what your linguistic help was for. And then you continue to be seen with him and
like, let's actually talk about the nature of the help, shall we? Because in the same article, they talk about what it was, right? So the question was, did Epstein lure minors across state lines in order to sexually abuse them? It was done over email, right? So Pinker has to have, like, looked at the details a little bit. It says in the letter that Dershowitz submitted to the judge, it says, to confirm our view of the plain meaning of the words, we asked Pinker, a noted linguist, to analyze the statute to determine the natural and linguistically logical reading or readings of the section. So they wanted him to look at the statute about enticing minors across state lines. We asked whether the statute contemplates necessarily that the means of communication must be the vehicle through which the persuading or enticing directly occurs. According to Dr. Pinker, that is the sole rational reading. So he's using his rationality cred here. But it's like such a technicality, right?
But there's no way you would offer that opinion without understanding some of the context.
Right. You know that it's about persuading or enticing a minor across state lines for sexual abuse. Right. That is the topic. So, yeah, I didn't know what it was that I was helping with. They just had me look at a statute. Yeah, what statute? Like, what statute, motherfucker?
It's just... And then after that, you know... is when Epstein got a plea deal, right? Like,
yeah. And, like, we don't know how much that little snippet helped him, but it does tell me something about Steven Pinker, that he was willing to help in that way.
Right. And then he's also gone out of his way, like in Jerry Coyne's blog, after people have started bringing this stuff up, right? In 2019, Pinker published a response in Jerry Coyne's blog about how much he actually always never liked Epstein, and how Epstein, voted him off the island. I don't know why he chose that phrase if he wants to deny going to the island, but
oh my God. I think that it is very easy to, after the public opinion has turned on a person, to be like, I never liked him, right? That counts for less than nothing.
That's actually shady when you're going so above and beyond to be like, no, I just didn't like the way he talked, and he interrupted. Yeah.
I actually found him very creepy.
Yeah, sure. That's why you helped in his case. That's why. And then he says about that photo that's been circulating, right? The photo that everyone posts under his thing. Now, it could totally be that you don't know who you're sitting next to or whatever. Like, people can be photographed with someone awful and they don't know. But this is someone that he's clearly known the problematic nature of, what he's being accused of, and helped to get him a plea deal. And then in 2014, he's seen sitting next to him. But then he says, you know, it was my friend Krauss that seated me there. And what's funny about that is that Lawrence Krauss,
that's right,
had also had like multiple allegations against him. And while I don't think anything legal came of them, like, it was obvious enough to anyone who cares about these things that these are multiple credible allegations in multiple publications. And, you know, maybe don't use him as your defense in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, truly, you know, we don't want to engage in a guilt by association fallacy here, but you got a lot of really bad friends.
And you know what? I just checked, and in 2022, Pinker went on Krauss's podcast. So clearly, it didn't bother him enough.
Oh, no, absolutely not. And I think that's really important to remember, is that after he finds out these things about somebody, it does not change his relationship to them.
Yes.
It only changes if there's enough of a backlash publicly.
Yes, exactly. And then the thing about publishing in Jerry Coyne's blog is also quite funny, because Jerry Coyne's blog is also the blog that did a whole thing about, convicted pedophile Jerry Sandusky. You know, just asking questions. Is he really all that bad? You know, like...
Yeah, it's important to really be skeptical about those things.
Yeah.
But not me. Don't be skeptical about me, because that makes you a science hater.
So everything around this story seems bad for Pinker.
That's right. Yeah, and this is a pattern for him where, you know, like, once we saw unequivocally that there was kind of an uptick in like incel violence and like revenge killings of women by misogynists, like red-pilled misogynists. Pinker wanted to make sure to very explicitly caution us against making what he called the statistically obtuse claim that there was a rise in misogynist violence happening. Like, that's where his energy was going.
Based on what?
Based on statistics.
Cherry-picked.
Yeah, absolutely. He just said the phrase statistically obtuse, hoping that like people would just stop thinking, right?
Right. I said statistically. That involves numbers.
Yeah, I said the numbers say stop yelling about women's safety.
Yeah. Don't ask me what numbers.
Yeah. And I also think that it's important to know that whenever one of his colleagues is accused of sexual impropriety, he is right there to defend them against this threat, you know, against them. So when Joshua Katz was discovered to have been engaging in inappropriate sexual relationships with his students, he wrote op-ed after op-ed defending him against what he considered to be an ideologically motivated attack.
Pinker did.
Yeah, absolutely. And he participated in this whole project among that whole cadre of academics and pundits of distracting people from the actual crime, which was sexual impropriety against students, and pretending that it was actually revenge for him saying something anti-woke. Because he said something disgusting about Black activists at his school at Princeton. He called them a terrorist group, and people did not like that, and people said they did not like that, but that is not what he was investigated for. They just want you to conflate the two.
And as we know that Pinker is fine with people saying that his ideological opponents are terrorists, right? Like, just like the students being called pro-Hamas students.
Yeah, he's called his own students terrorists. That's fine. You should be able to do that, especially if they're brown or Black, right? But
right. But if we were to say, like, white centrists who identify as moderate and minimize sex crimes, are terrorists.
No, that would be wrong. That would be statistically obtuse of you.
Got it.
Yeah, and this happens behind the scenes also. So, for example, there was a professor at the University of Miami, Colin McGinn, who sexually harassed his graduate student. The graduate student reported him, and while the investigation was ongoing, Steven Pinker wrote an email or a letter to the one of the, I think it was the chair of the department, asking them to dismiss the investigation. Like, it totally didn't involve him, right? It was a sexual harassment case at a different school against people that he doesn't work with. And he was just like, how dare you?
It's like a reverse superhero that steps in to defend anyone like accused of sexual harassment.
And he went in hard. He said, as well as harming the reputation and intellectual quality of the University of Miami, such an action, like, punishing him for sexual harassment, such an action would put a chill on communication between faculty and graduate students and on the openness and informality on which scholarship depends. So he really did just pull out, like, I guess you can't even talk to women at work anymore. after a grad student got sexually harassed. And then, this is my favorite part, he said, if the dismissal proceeds, I will certainly bring it up with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, FIRE, on whose advisory board I sit. So he's like definitely threatening that there will be legal consequences if they dismiss this professor for sexual harassment.
Sounds very free speech.
We love free speech.
Very much so. I mean, and you can just see how dispassionate and neutral he is about these things, right? Like
he did that. So yeah, he definitely.
So like every couple of years, he has some kind of association defending or helping some kind of sex
why does this keep happening to me?
It's amazing. How does that keep happening to someone? And then let's talk about a little bit more about better angels of our nature here, because there's a lot going on there too.
Actually, I think it's really important to really understand what the thesis of that book really is, because it's freaking gross.
But they say angels in the title.
Yeah, angels are so nice. Yeah. So the idea being, he's like, humanity has like angels on one shoulder and demons on the other, right? So like the angels are our tendencies toward cooperation, altruism, empathy, and the demons on our other shoulder are like tribal hostility, suspicion, and violence. And so he's imagining like a little sliding scale right between those two, and we keep heading towards the angel direction over time. And isn't that nice? Isn't that like a nice thing to think?
Of course. And only evil wokes would want to disrupt that truly real picture of reality.
And like it would be really interesting to think about ways to prove that like suspicion of like out-group members has gone down over time, or that like hostility towards people who are unlike you has gone down over time, or that like cooperation has, like, people are more prone to cooperate now than they used to be. Like, that would be so cool, but that is not what his book does, right? It is specifically about violence, and it is specifically about war and interpersonal violence. Those are like the specific kinds of violence that he wants to measure. So he's already taken this big idea of like angels versus demons, and the angels are winning, and he's boiled it down to not just one aspect of the demons, which is the violence, but just some kinds of violence.
Does he discuss like the industrialization of violence?
That is on the angel side. That's a win for the angels. Good job, everybody.
How so?
Because it made us richer, right? And so that makes it good.
I see. And I guess there was no AI-ification of violence back then.
Yeah. And And what he's doing is he's participating in an ideology, sorry, Pinker, but it is ideological, that wants to draw a line between like pre-modern history humanity and modern history humanity to show our superiority, to help us like feel good, right? Like we feel good about that.
Mm-hmm. Like, look at those savages. We're so much better than that.
And it's an ideology that kind of came out of the late 1800s, early 1900s, which is the moral progress ideology. And it is about this sense that like we as humans are getting better. And in earlier versions of like EvoPsych, they used to try to make it genetic, that they're like, it's because we evolved in our genes. And now EvoPsych is like, okay, we understand that like I can't say that genetically we are different from how we were in the 1400s. Like, I understand that doesn't make any sense. So instead, what I will say is it's culture, which you might recognize as an excuse that racists use all the time when they know they're not allowed to say that non-white people are genetically inferior. They'll just move the goalposts over to saying, actually, it's their culture that makes them inferior. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it is so easy. Like, you thought you hit the ball there, Steve, but you did not. Like, we saw you palm it.
And as we know, I mean, throughout history, white people have never done any violence ever.
Right. No. Why would we ever do
I'm
that,
sure
right?
Every historian will agree with me that...
Well, and if we did, okay, it's either because it's in the past and therefore the demons were winning, or it's like a
Right.
statistical anomaly and we shouldn't think too hard about it, you know, like World War II.
Oh, yeah, oops. Yeah, just like mistakes happen sometimes.
Yeah, oops. Oh my gosh, oops, you guys. But the factor that he posits has created that change is what he calls the civilizing process, which
It's
I
so
know,
funny.
right? So that is from a philosopher, Elias, right? And the civilizing process is this idea that like norms have been handed down from the aristocracy, and like the more like power and visibility that the aristocracy got, the more civilized the lower classes became because they adopted those norms. And so it's like a trickle down philosophy, but for like being nice. And like that, the civilizing process is a thing that people have talked about a lot in like history and philosophy. And there have been huge issues already pointed out by those fields and like attempts to kind of reformulate the hypothesis in order to address those issues. And Pinker was just like, no, I don't want to read those. Thank you. I just will take it in its original form. Civilizing process 1.0, please.
He is such a caricature. Like, the more we talk about him, I am just in awe of anybody who manages to respect him intellectually. How do you manage that?
I think you look very gray-haired and intellectual, and you stroke your chin a lot, and you say things like rationality and civility.
You just say them, yes.
Yeah, and also, like, he has the Harvard name behind him, right? He has a named chair, professorship at Harvard.
Harvard.
Yeah, right? I know. And I do have, like, kind of an ageist belief that, like, if you manage to secure a position at an Ivy League school before, you know, like, 1990, I consider you kind of a Nepo baby. Like, you know, you got in there when there weren't a lot of goers. Like, not a lot of people had access to the kind of education that you needed to even be considered for a job like that, and certainly didn't have the connections that you needed to secure a position. And so you could be, like, intellectually lazy and still make it, you know?
Like, but this is, like, so intellectually lazy. It's truly astounding.
Well, yeah, The other thing is, like, you can do some good work and that will secure your position, and then you can absolutely take your foot off the gas and coast for the rest of the time.
So is that civilizing process? Like, is that why Pinker's always photographed holding brains and skulls? Like,
yeah, because he's so civilized.
He's so civilized.
You have to be really civilized to extract a brain from a person and then hold it. You have to use some really civilized chemicals. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so, like, this idea, and he comes back to it a lot, where he's like, norms and, like, fashions and ways of, like, just doing, like, the small things are, like, the same thing as moral improvement. And so when he's asked to explain why, like, the 70s were kind of out of control and, like, violent crime went up in America and England and other places in the West, he's like, oh yeah, well, that's because of the decline in the status of aristocratic people, actually. So he said, this is in Better Angels, he says, the civilizing process had been a flow of norms and manners from the upper classes downward, but as Western countries became more democratic, the upper classes became increasingly discredited as moral paragons, and hierarchies of taste and manners were leveled. The informalization affected the way people dressed as they abandoned hats, gloves, ties, and dresses for casual sportswear. This is my inflection, obviously. And then here's where I get to...
This is like straight off of Reddit, like our atheism or something.
No, this is so ridiculous, right? Because you can see a tweet from the worst person in the world about how, like, women wearing leggings outside is the same thing as, like, moral degradation. And that's what we're hearing.
And how men should wear fedoras. And...
Yeah. Men, what's stopping you from dressing like this? And it's a guy who looks like an absolute douchebag. Yeah. So then he goes into the linguistic claims, which is where I get to go, hey. He said, it affected the language as people started to address their friends with first names instead of Mr. and Mrs. and Miss. And it could be seen in countless other ways in which speech and demeanor became less mannered and more spontaneous. And he's got a thing about how, like, it became cool to, like, laugh at fancy ladies, and that's not okay. And he says one of the side effects was to undermine the prestige of aristocratic and bourgeois lifestyles that had, over the course of several centuries, become less violent than those of the working class and underclass. Instead of values trickling down from the court, they bubbled up from the street. Isn't that a horrible idea? That, like, things are democratic. So anyway, but this thing about, like, oh, people started calling each other by their first name. Like, if you look at the field of linguistics that I do, which is, like, pragmatics and politeness, like, politeness and sort of, like, interpersonal communication, there's, like, a couple of different factors that you can dial up and dial down. And one thing that often happens is when you get less formal, you become more close. Like, that's what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. So by calling somebody, like, Ms. Jefferson or whatever, or calling her Molly, when you call her Molly, you're making a claim to closeness. And that's not, like, anti-civil, right? Say, telling somebody through the way that you're addressing them that you consider yourselves to be close is positive in some ways, right?
Right.
Like, you know, if you go to court and, you know, Judge John Billingsham is up there telling you that, you know, you're in big trouble, and you're like, hey, Johnny boy, let's try that a different way. Like, that's not going to work, right? Obviously, there are times when hierarchy is supposed to be respected.
Right.
But calling your friend by their first name is not one of those times. In fact, what that's doing is dialing up the warmth of your interaction. And that could be, like, if you just framed it like that, suddenly that's not a demon on your shoulder. That's an angel, because now you're being more pro-social and you're being more empathetic by calling them by their first name. So, like, it's truly just his own opinion that, like, we should be running around calling each other by their last name.
Is that really, like, what his point is, though?
This is his use of example, right? To suggest that by abandoning the norms of the aristocracy, we have participated in our own moral decline. I know. And then, but he doesn't, because we never brought that back, right? Even though in the 90s, all of the statistics that he's tracking went back down, like all the violence went back down, things got better and have continued to get better, according to his metrics. He never explains why, like, that happened despite our not having brought back those formalities, right? Like, we still wear leggings and we still wear, we don't wear ties most of the time, and we don't refer to each other as Mrs. or Mr. or Miss, but we're not violent anymore to the level that we were in the 70s. So, like, what did it then?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems like he just uses the hyper optimism when he wants to make a point about people should shut up about civil rights.
Right. Yeah.
And
and
otherwise, he's happy to talk about the decline of hierarchies and aristocracy.
And of course, it comes back to, like, the heteronormative nuclear family requirement, right? Because he goes on to say in another part that he finds it really upsetting that people should devote their energies. He says, like, the idea that people should devote their energies to a monogamous relationship in which they raise their children in a safe environment became a target of howling ridicule.
Oh my God, are you serious?
Look at me, for example, right? I come under fire for being, like, too woke to function all the time.
Too woke to function.
I am like one of the images of, like, the people, I've got the colorful hair. I think civil rights was a good thing. Like, I know, a monster, right? I got married and had 2 children, and I'm raising them in a house with locks on it. Like, I am an example of the kind of thing that he thinks that I would absolutely hate. And that's because he doesn't represent his opposition correctly, right? He doesn't understand. He probably understands. I think he is a smart person, but he's not representing us.
Yeah, a lot of his stuff seems to be based on a straw man. Like, even just the idea of his book, The Blank Slate, seems to be based on a straw man.
Yes, it absolutely is. And it comes out when he engages with somebody who is an expert, right? Like, sometimes he'll do these, like, debates on stage at, like, he did one at Berkeley. And it comes out there because he'll be like, you think this, and the opposition will be like, but that's not accurate, and, like, here's what actually it is, and you don't have an argument against that because it's much more reasonable than what you're pretending I said.
Right.
And that happens all the time too, where experts will say, like, you didn't characterize this fact accurately, or you didn't characterize this phenomenon accurately, and Pinker will just point at them and go to the Guardian or whatever and say, they hate that I dared to even criticize their darling whatever, right? And it's like, that's not what they said. They said you got the basic facts wrong. Like, you need to start from understanding what is actually being said before you can rebut it, because your rebuttal's not going to make any sense, except to people who already agree with you, who already wanted to hear things from your perspective. And, like, right now people are talking about Daniel Dennett because he recently died. And Pinker is one of them, right? He misses him dearly. It was his, he loved Daniel Dennett a lot. And one of Daniel Dennett's main, like, quotes, I'm going to paraphrase it, but one of his main ideas that he liked to promote was, before you can ever say something to rebut someone else's point, you need to make sure that you have understood it and that you can see why they believe it, and you can see, like, what the strong points are of their belief before you can come back and say, here's why I think you're wrong, because you're not going to be effective otherwise. That's where I think Daniel Dennett was wrong, right? Because clearly you can be quite effective.
Right. I mean, Sam Harris also does this whole steel manning fetish, but
they love to talk about steel manning, yeah.
But they don't do it. Like, they don't do it at all. They like to talk about doing it, but they
well,
don't do
again,
it.
it's the aesthetics of reasonableness. It's the aesthetics of rationality without the actual practices that are required to accomplish it. And that comes from, I think, a lack of respect for the opposition and a lack of respect for the principles of skepticism.
Right. I mean, I think it's okay to have a lack of respect for the opposition, depending on who the opposition is. Well,
that's fair. I should probably get off my high horse about that, because I'm not very respectful.
Like, I have no qualms about saying that I do not respect the IDW types. But, I'm not going to lie about their positions.
And, I don't see any reason why I should sit down and hear that, the elites of this world are the people to look for how to behave, when the elites of this world have done some of the worst things, to the people that they've exploited. Why would I ever, if I have these aristocrats in my life, which I would now call oligarchs, right? That's who we have in our society. If I'm supposed to look at oligarchs,
if I'm supposed
to look at Elon Musk, or even, Bill Gates or somebody, and emulate them, then this world would be a much worse place, because it would be full of exploitation. It would be full of people directing the flow of aid and of science in directions that just hit them right in the moment, and it would be holding us back a lot. So no, I don't think I will be doing that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And in Better Angels of Our Nature, he has a chapter on the rights revolutions, where he talks about rape.
Oh boy.
And there's two sources that he cites. One is Christina Hoff Sommers, and she is known as based mom, fan of Milo Yiannopoulos. Basically MRA, men's rights activist, anti-feminist, extremely right-wing, just awful, extremely biased, works for a right-wing think tank. And the other person is this Heather McDonald.
Wow, she is absolutely out of control.
She really...
She's scary.
Unhinged rape apologist. Christina Hoff Sommers is bad,
deep racist, truly hateful about Black people.
Yes, very openly racist. And Pinker blurbed her book, and so he cites these two people to downplay rape stats. Do these sound all like reasonable sources on rape?
What, you mean the right-wing, the author of The War Against Boys, Christina Hoff Sommers? What do you mean?
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support it, there are several ways you can do that. You can share it online, talk about what you just heard. You can leave a 5-star review to help others find it too. And you can also subscribe via patreon.com/nice mangoes. No E in mangoes. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter before it's completely wrecked, you'll find me at Nice Mangoes. Again, no E in mangoes.